There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
There's lots of interesting features that come out of our work on wealth. One clear-cut result is just how much of wealth is concentrated in the rich part of the world. We're talking now about North America, Western Europe, and rich Asia-Pacific countries, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, that type of thing. Really, a very, very high proportion of global wealth is in those countries. There's a lot of other countries which are catching up in the sense that their wealth growth is much faster, and I think that is another feature on the whole. If you take a longer period, then China in particular, India, quite a few of the emerging Asian markets are doing very well and catching up. But it's still a long way to go to catch up these other rich countries. In terms of wealth inequality, certainly what is coming out this year in our work is just how much higher the wealth inequality is in the emerging world, the developing world, the emerging markets, whatever you want to call that. On the whole, most of the Western Europe is roughly the same in wealth inequality level as it was back in 1980. It's what we would call medium or middle wealth inequality. A couple of the countries are above that. Some of the Scandinavian countries are quite interestingly have a little bit higher than average wealth inequality. And then at the top end, there's two countries which stand out in the developed world, and that is the US and Switzerland. They're the ones which have wealth inequality levels now, which are really quite reminiscent of what they were 100 years ago. So in those countries, they're back to 100 years ago. If you look at the developing world, then, in fact, the majority of countries are up there in that top, comparable with the levels that one observed in the US 100 years ago. When one asks, is that unusual, or is there some worry about that, I think you have to look at the reasons for it. And the reasons are not well documented. This is not a research area where people have done a lot of work. But I think one reason is that in a developing country, you get some people who are really, if you like, part of the globalized world. They're connected with the other parts of the world, and they do fairly well because their sort of returns, their skills are being rewarded in a global economy, whereas there's a lot of other people who are really just just still involved in their rather crude, backward agricultural area in particular, and their really wealth levels are very low. So you get this inequality because of this difference between the relation, exactly where people are in the country and how they relate to the global economy. The other factor I think is quite important is countries which are growing fast in terms of wealth. I think they are typically wealth inequalities increasing in those countries. In fact, that's one of the features that we've discovered this year. And I think there it's because if we take China, where our evidence suggests that wealth inequality has been growing very fast, I think if you look and say it's growing fast because the people who are doing very well, they are often small businesses, small family groups. They've been doing very well. They're being rewarded in very reasonable ways for their efforts and their success. But they haven't had time, if you like, to spread the wealth. Whereas in a developed country, if people have a successful business, it's often part owned by various other people. The shares get spread. Of course, over time it gets spread because it's inherited or passed on to various sorts of people. So the initial success, the initial rewards get spread out over time, and as if a country the wealth is growing very fast, then they just haven't had the time for that to happen. So if you like, it's the new wealth is going to be more unequal than the older wealth, and on the whole, new wealth is being produced faster in countries where wealth is growing. So I think that's one of the other factors. So those, when you look at it, you have to ask yourself: is this something that's persisting, or is it, if you like, a transitory phase that's going to resolve itself over time? And will the emerging markets and developing countries move towards the wealth distribution seen now in developing countries? And I would say, on the whole, I think there's good reason to expect that to happen over time. If we look over time, then inequality within countries is certainly looks like it's been increasing in the last few years. It has moved down at various stages within the recent past as well. So it's not a clear-cut trend. But it is quite high, and it could well be increasing for the reasons because of wealth is growing and countries are developing. When you look at the global picture, it becomes more complicated because you have two factors. We talk about within country inequality and between country inequality. The within country just depends on inequality within countries. Between country depends on the levels. And so we then have to take into account whether the levels between countries are converging or diverging. On the whole, the developing world wealth has been growing faster. So that's one factor which is going to tend to reduce between country inequality on the global scale. So we've got these two counteracting factors, if you like. The likelihood is that within countries wealth inequality is increasing, partly because of globalization and that sort of factor. But between countries, the same globalizing effects are tending to reduce differences between countries. So these two things are offsetting. And often there's really not very much, on the whole, they net out, and so there's not very much change on the global scale. It's not very evident. And very often it can be, if there is any observed trend globally, it's often just because of one country, and China is the one that's the dominant influence there, because it's been really moving up through the spectrum of the world wealth distribution. We have a very interesting picture which we developed for the first wider study and which we've repeated every year, which shows the regional distribution of, we take each decile in the world and give a picture to show which region the people are in. And in this picture you see China as a big blob in the middle of the world. And you see this blob over time moving towards the right as the Chinese progressively get richer and move up the wealth distribution globally. That clearly is a sort of equalizing factor. But as I say, there are other factors as well. So the net result isn't very fast, and that's also true in within country inequality. These trends are, on the whole, are quite small. So you have to take rather long periods, usually 20 or 30 years, before you really notice much of a trend over time.
The Occupy Wall Street protesters popularized the term the 1%, blaming the world's wealthiest 1% for all of the planet's problems. But this figure is wildly inaccurate, not to mention insane, because 1% of the Earth's 7 billion people is 70 million people. Surely 70 million people aren't to blame for the planet's problems? But what else can you expect from people who mindlessly would chant, "We are the 99%"? I mean, you can't expect them to actually do any math, could you? No. Okay, sorry. Back to a serious point here. If you really want to look at the the invisible empire, the ruling elite, the super class, I mean, it's really more like 0.00001%, or even 0.00001%, 5 zeros, which is 70 people. So somewhere between, just a few hundred people is really the capstone on the pyramid. In fact, one of Henry Kissinger's close associates, Henry Kissinger, of course, the just infamous Illuminati war criminal who said that power was the greatest aphrodisiac. Henry Kissinger, the guy who was actually appointed by George W. Bush to be the first head commissioner on the 9/11 commission until the families found out that he had close ties with the bin Laden family, and then he had to, step down from that. But anyway, this scumbag has an advisory firm called Kissinger and Associates that was headed up by David Rothkopf, who, I don't know, maybe grew a conscience because he wrote a book in 2008 called Superclass, the Global Power Elite and the World That They Are Making, where he made some surprising revelations that seemed to confirm what many supposed, quote, conspiracy theorists had been saying for years. For example, he wrote, quote, "A global elite has merged over the past several decades that has vast more power than any group on the planet. Each of the members of the superclass has the ability to regularly influence the lives of millions of people in multiple countries worldwide. Each actively exercises their power, and they often amplify it through the development of relationships with others in this class." He goes on to say, quote, "that such a group exists is indisputable. Heads of state, CEOs of the world's largest companies, media barons, billionaires, top military commanders, a select few religious leaders, and even terrorist leaders and master criminals meet the above criteria for membership." He identifies the, quote, superclass as being approximately 6,000 people, which, according to Occupy Wall Street math, would be really approximately 0.00030 0.0001%. And of course, the elite Illuminati is more like 0.00001% or 0.00001%, somewhere around 100 or so, just a few hundred individuals. A couple other interesting quotes in this book is that he says, quote, "From behind the scenes, it's clear that these individuals influence everything from the way currencies are priced worldwide to which political candidates would have sufficient funding for their presidential campaigns." I just can't even believe that he would actually admit this. He surprisingly stated that the war on terror, and this is probably where he started to grow a conscience, was basically the supposed big threat is exaggerated. I mean, he was talking about how the same thing happened during the communist Cold War with Russia, where he says the United States, while the United States was in a real struggle with Russia, the assertion that communists were everywhere and the intent on undermining the United States was vastly exaggerated in much the same way the terror threat is exaggerated today. Oh, that's very interesting. He also referenced the Bilderberg Group and the Bohemian Grove in the book, where he said that the Bilderberg Group meeting does reveal the, quote, informal mechanisms of power. And he was well aware of the allegations about the Bohemian Grove, saying, quote, critics on the left worry about a political conspiracy and global policies plotted at the Grove, while critics on the right cite stories of homosexual rituals, devil worship, and child sacrifice. Very, very interesting. Again, from a former close associate of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, by the way, who called our military men, quote, dumb, stupid animals who were good pawns for foreign policy. You might have seen that quote floating around the internet, quote, dumb, stupid animals to be used for pawns, as pawns for America's foreign policy. The quote itself actually comes from a very reputable source, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, in their book, The Final Days. These were the two guys that really brought Nixon down with Watergate. Two very well-respected reporters. They're sourcing, one of their sources as having Henry Kissinger, of course, call our military men dumb, stupid animals. Henry Kissinger, of course, I don't have the clip here pulled up, said that the economic crisis of 2008, the economic crash, was really fantastic and a good chance for President Obama, Bilderberg Obama, to implement the, quote, New World Order. Very, very interesting. So when you hear these Occupy people, if they ever, try to make a comeback, talking about the 1%, they obviously haven't done the math, because that's 70 million people. The vast majority of the Occupy Wall Street protesters were just communists or just big government-loving liberals and losers who just lazy, don't understand how hard you actually have to work to just even get by in this life. And so they just clamored for the evil 1%, again, 70 million people, to just be taxed more and then have them, just given free stuff. Yeah, free education, free rent, free everything, man. Just forgive student loans. I mean, it was incredible. Unaware that, the evil 1%, the people that are making a bunch of money with the exception of the 0.00001% Illuminati elite, super class psychos. These are the people that actually, give these people jobs. It's just incredible. When have you ever gotten a job from a poor person? These are the people that build businesses and have the infrastructure to actually supply jobs. But what do you expect in the dumbed down New World Order when these poor peons and pawns of this system are just clamoring for a big communist, massive super state, all powerful, nanny state, cradle to grave government? So there you have it. It's not 1%. It's really 0.0001%. It is the Illuminati elite. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you're new. Check out some of the previous videos and the playlists. Stay tuned. There's more videos coming soon.
This is not the time for political fun and games. This is the time for a new beginning. I ask you now to put aside any feelings of frustration or helplessness about our political institutions and join me in this dramatic but responsible plan.
Join me. President Ronald Wilson Reagan addressing the country from the Oval Office in July of 1981. President Reagan had assumed office just 6 months earlier. The nation was mired in a bad recession, and Mr. Reagan used the power and the prestige of a primetime Oval Office address to present his way out, his vision of how the country could get back on its economic feet.
In a few days, the Congress will stand at the fork of two roads. One road is all too familiar to us. It leads ultimately to higher taxes. The other road promises to renew the American spirit. It's a road of hope and opportunity. It places the direction of your life back in your hands where it belongs.
tax cuts. Not just any tax cuts, the largest set of tax cuts this country had ever seen. With all sorts of charts and graphs at his disposal, President Reagan walked the country step by step through his tax plan, an across-the-board tax cut of 25% for all income brackets. Everybody gets a tax cut. After months of selling his plan, Congress finally passed it, and President Reagan signed it into law.
This represents $750 billion in tax cuts over the next 5 years. And this is only the beginning.
And thus was born a new economic philosophy, Reaganomics. Cutting government spending, cutting regulation, and cutting taxes. Cutting taxes especially for the richest Americans. President Reagan's tax plan cut the top tax rate for the wealthiest Americans from 70% to 50%. Why cut taxes so dramatically for the richest of the rich in the middle of a recession?
More trickle-down economics.
Trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics. The idea of trickle-down economics is basically this. You cut tax rates for the richest Americans, therefore the richest Americans have more. They have more money in their pockets. Therefore they have more money to spend and invest. And as they spend and invest, the effect of rich people's good fortune and rich people's spending trickles down to everybody else in the economy. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? That was the idea. That was the plan. That did not happen. Reaganomics was a spectacular success in some ways. It was a spectacular success for the richest Americans in the country who benefited the most from President Reagan's historic debt-exploding, budget-busting tax cuts. In 1980, the top 1% of Americans earned wages of about $110,000 a year. By 1990, after about 10 years of Reaganomics, boing, the top 1% had seen their wages rise by 80%. Trickle-down economics, though, right? What's good for the rich is good for all of us, right? Not quite. Here's the average wages of the rest of the country in 1980, and here's what happened for the rest of the country after about 10 years of Reaganomics. Flat. A whopping 3% rise in wages in 10 years. The richest people see their fortunes go up like the Matterhorn. Everybody else, nothing. This is what family income growth looked like during the 1980s. Look at that. The richest 1% of Americans had an awesome decade. They saw their family income skyrocket by 74%. Everybody else, not so much. In fact, the poorest Americans saw their income shrink by more than 4%. That was Reaganomics. That was what Reaganomics did. That was the impact of Reaganomics. That was the result of this experiment called trickle-down economics. The rich did great. Everybody else, still waiting for the trickle.
Today, downtown Chicago is getting ready for the Christmas shopping season, but the merchants in one neighborhood, Inglewood, expect little Christmas business this year. Most of their customers are on public aid, which has been cut by the Reagan administration. At Judge Barber's furniture store, pre-Christmas sales have not attracted shoppers, and Barber blames Reaganomics.
The customers that are coming in are certainly less than those that were coming in before the economics of Mr. Reagan's took place.
But some people elsewhere will be spending more this Christmas at luxury stores like Neiman Marcus in Northbrook, Illinois, a wealthy suburb of Chicago. Store manager Larry Gore predicts record sales, especially in jewelry and furs. Gore says his customers have more to spend this year because of the Reagan tax cuts.
At the end of 1989, after 8 years of Reaganomics, here's where the country stood. Income gap between richest and poorest, biggest since 1947. That was the headline on UPI on December 30th, 1989. That month, Congress released a report on Reaganomics that concluded, quote, upper-income Americans were the main direct beneficiaries of tax cuts in the early 80s. There's no evidence in our data that those benefits have trickled down. Aside from not trickling, the era of Reaganomics also had one other awesome side effect. When President Reagan came into office in 1981, he inherited a $994 million national debt. By the time he left, it had ballooned to $2.6 billion. Ronald Reagan, patron saint of fiscal conservatism, supposedly, grew the national debt by an astonishing 186% during his 8 years in office, which is what tends to happen when the government drastically reduces the amount of tax revenue it collects. When the Reagan folks tried to argue that the huge deficits they were creating were not that big of a deal, they were kindly corrected by editorials like this one in the Washington Post from January 1988. Quote, the deficit is a terrible legacy for which the country will be paying socially as well as financially for years. The only thing worse would be to believe the gloss now being put on it that would condemn another generation to repeat what the country should repent instead. So the largest income inequality since the government started tracking those things, and a skyrocketing national debt. Thank you, Reaganomics.
And this is only the beginning.
On that point, Ronald Reagan was right. Trickle-down economics is back. It's making a comeback.
What we've got to do is try as we may and see if we can deliver to make sure that tax rates don't go up on anybody. What we need is to get the entrepreneurs and investors back being willing to commit capital.
Anybody that thinks that raising taxes on job creators is going to create jobs, I think is going to meet with an argument for me.
You can't have a healthy economy if you raise taxes on those that you expect to reinvest in the economy and to hire more people.
You can't have a healthy economy unless you give special bonus tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires. If millionaires and billionaires can't get an extra tax cut, nobody else should get a tax cut either. Everybody else's taxes can go up. Those are the people, those rich people, those are the ones who invest. Give them money and watch it trickle down to everybody else. Go ahead, watch it trickle down to everybody else. Just watch. See what happens. Watch the country right itself by giving massive tax cuts to the super rich.
Average hourly wages have dropped 4.5%. That 5 million workers have lost their jobs because of factory closings and corporate cutbacks, and that the nation's richest families are getting a bigger slice of the economic pie, while the growing number of poor people are getting a smaller slice.
Just watch. There is a key difference, of course, between now and 1981. Now, we have a president in the White House who doesn't subscribe to the economic theory that one of his Republican predecessors used to call voodoo economics.
We've been told that the way to a stronger economy was to give huge tax breaks to corporations and the wealthiest Americans, and somehow prosperity would trickle down. Well, now we know the truth. It didn't work. Instead of prosperity trickling down, pain has trickled up.
It didn't work. Giving billions of dollars in tax breaks to the super rich did not work. The difference between now and 1981 is not on the Republican side. They're still selling trickle down. The difference between now and then is the president now doesn't buy it, and the rest of us know what happened the last time somebody tried to promise us a trickle. Tomorrow, Democrats in the United States Senate have an opportunity to render their judgment, a return to trickle-down economics or not. Good night.
The gap between the rich and the poor continues to be one of the long-standing societal problems in the U.S. In 2012, we saw Occupy Wall Street rise up and attempt to bring inequality to the forefront of the American conversation. The 99% rising up against the 1%, of course. But do we really understand that gap? How rich is the richest in America? One economist says we don't understand. In a New York Times editorial called Our Invisible Rich, Paul Krugman says it's not the poor who are hidden under wraps, it's the wealthy. Joining me to discuss is Redacted Tonight's John F. O'Donnell. John, always good to have you on the show. Okay, so we know Occupy Wall Street really coined this phrase. They really pushed it forward, the 1%, setting up that dichotomy. Do you think that was really the catchiest way for Americans to get a better sense of how rich the rich really are?
Well, I think it was definitely a good start to have people at least think in that way. Be like, oh, wow, this small amount of people has this much wealth for the entire nation and things like that. But and I think it was a great rallying cry to change the conversation, and I think that was one of the greatest things out of the Occupy movement. But beyond that, I think now what's happening is people are talking about the 0.1%. So this 1% has a lot of money, a lot of wealth. I think it's something like over $500,000 puts you in the 1%. But some of these 0.1% people have billions of dollars. So it really is, and like up to hundreds of billions of dollars. So it is this whole other world, and because their lives are so removed from the general public, we don't really have a perception of it. You'll hear about celebrities having a certain amount of money, but it's nothing like what these really elite people have.
Okay, but some people will say, does it really matter if, we imagine these financial execs driving Bentleys to their vacation spots, or that we know they're actually flying private helicopters to these places? I mean, does it really make a difference how much we underestimate how wealthy they really are?
Well, I think so, and I think so for the reason that it kind of points out that a lot of these people, let's say they want more deregulation and stuff like that, that's only because it's like they want all of the money. I mean, is it the sort of thing where when you really, really win, you get everything? And it's very strange that so many of us look up to these people and put them on a pedestal and stuff like that. And it's like oftentimes they say they believe in the invisible hand of the market, but they won't acknowledge that they have such institutionalized advantage that that is the reason that they're doing so well and other people aren't. It's like we were talking about before about trickle-down economics.
It's true.
It's the only people that think trickle-down economics are those who are doing the trickling,
Right.
not those that
The
are
tricklers.
The tricklers.
The tricklers.
Yeah, the tricklers are tricking everybody into
Right.
thinking that trickle-down economics is a
Right.
good thing, while those being trickled upon are just like, you know, I'm still kind of hungry.
waiting for it.
Yeah, I'm
New
still
numbers out
waiting
from the
for it.
Pew
Yeah.
Research Center about the wealth gap in America. The numbers, as usual, are not good. Let me show you the trends that have happened in this country from 1983 to the year 2013, which is the years that they tracked. This is a comparison of upper income median net growth compared to middle income families. So back in 1983, the number was 3.4, the gap between upper and middle income households. Today, it's at 6.6. It's at a record high. So upper income growth is 6.6 times greater than middle income growth. So the rich are getting much richer and at twice the rate they were back in 1983. So it has not abated at all. Now remember, in the 1980s, we were told that it's okay, we're going to do Reaganomics, and we're going to give a lot of breaks to the rich. We're going to give tax cuts, we're going to do, give subsidies to corporations, and all these different advantages, right? But it's okay because it's going to trickle down to you. Well, the evidence is in. It's not like 1980 was a couple of years ago. We've had a long, long time to look at the numbers. Now it's been about 33 years. And in this period, we're looking at 30 years there that was tracked. It has not trickled down. I mean, of course, it depends on your definition of trickle down. Something's trickled down on our head, right? But the money has gone completely up. Now, that's compared to middle income people. Now, get a load of this comparison. Those same upper income families are now nearly 70 times wealthier than low income families, also a record gap. 70 times, okay? Now, look, I'm a capitalist. I want to be rich. I believe in the American dream. And as I look at some of these countries, I think, okay, I'm not sure I'd want to live in Denmark, okay, given their structure and how things are incentivized there. I'll show you that in a little bit. But this is outrageous. This is beyond all bounds of reason. Okay, let me show you what's happened in our so-called economic recovery lately. So the income wealth between 2010 and 2013. Well, okay, good. Upper income, we have had an economic recovery. Has gone from $595,300 to all the way up to $639,400. Now, that's not your income, that's your wealth. Okay, I should be clear about that. So that's the wealth for the upper income brackets. Okay, so that went up. Great, we have an economic recovery. Well, when you look at middle income, not so much. Middle income families were absolutely flat at $96,500. And when you look at lower income families, not only did they not go up, they dropped from $10,500 to $9,300. And that's under President Obama. That's under our so-called economic recovery. Where's the recovery for us? If you're middle income, no recovery at all. And if you're lower income, you've lost ground during the recovery, the so-called recovery. Gee, I wonder why Democrats couldn't get people out to vote. I mean, you delivered in spades for the rich, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you're doing an economic recovery, the rich should get richer too. But so should the middle class, and so should the poor. But it didn't happen for the rest of us. So that's why people couldn't get excited about President Obama. It's not that complicated. It has nothing to do with all these fake scandals that Republicans talk about. It's not like people are like, oh, I really got to go vote against Obama. If you're a middle-class family who's an independent and is not knee-deep in Fox News or Republican or Democratic politics, they weren't out there going like, oh, Benghazi, let me go vote. No, they were out there, well, where's the recovery? I don't see it, because they literally didn't see it. It didn't come to them. Now, one more chart. Now, unfortunately, we don't have it for you here, so you're going to have to take my word for it. I don't know where it went. Anyway, but it's an important part of the story. When you look at this chart, you've got 3 different categories here. Bottom 90%, top 10%, and then top 1%. And it ranges from Denmark to the United States. When you look at Denmark's chart, the bottom 90% actually have a very solid share of the income growth from 1975 to 2007. The top 1%, not that much. The top 10% have about 10% of the share, which is amazing, right? And then as you go through Portugal, Sweden, Spain, etc., the top 1% and the top 10% get more and more and more, but it's not really out of control until you get to Australia, UK, Canada, and the US. But look at the US numbers. They are stunning. This is share of income growth from 1975 to 2007. About 50%, almost half of the entire growth went to just the top 1%. And the top 10% got about 80% of the growth. 80% of the growth. And when you look at all the countries combined, you see that it didn't have to be so. It's not like this is what normally happens. This is a normal evolution of economics. No, it's how you set the rules. Denmark set the rules one way, France set them another way. They got different results. We set them a third way, and we got dramatically different results. And it's obvious from the numbers that we set the rules in favor of the rich. Of course, and it never trickled down. It wasn't supposed to trickle down. This chart is exactly what they intended. They don't look at this and say, oh, shoot, look at that income inequality. They look at this and think, mission accomplished. Look, man, you don't have to be a wild-eyed socialist to say that chart is insane. I believe in capitalism. I run a corporation. The Young Turks is an LLC. It's a corporation, technically. I'm a business owner. I want the rich to get a good share of the income, definitely. But this is insane. This is insane. How can you look at it and not see that it's insane? 80% of the income growth goes to just the top 10%. 50% basically goes to just the top 1%. It doesn't have to be that way. When they tell you that that's what capitalism is, they're lying to you. All those other countries have really strong economies, companies, you name it. They're not in squalor. They're doing perfectly fine. It's just that the income is shared in different ways, and everybody who works shares in it, at least to some degree. How can anybody look at all these numbers and say that trickle-down economics worked? No person who's actually honest can say that. So if you hear someone on TV telling you that, you know that they're doing it for a purpose, because they're in the bracket who made out like bandits, and they don't want you to know.
All right, so we talked a lot about the 1% on the show, and an interesting study came out by Sadoff Investment Research breaking down some of the economics of what's going on in America today. So this is from 2012. The average household income of Americans is about $30,000. The average household of the top 1%ers is about $1.2 million, which is 41 times the average family's income. The average household of the top 0.1% is about $6 million, which is 206 times the average family's income. So what I think is interesting about this is that, you know, when you think of the 1%, I think people think these are the people that have, like, you know, an armada of planes and houses everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. Now, they do have over $1 million, which I think probably we all aspire to have, and this is America, and everybody should have something. But should we be focusing more on that 0.1% than the 1%? Because that 0.1, that 6 million, that's sort of where you're getting into the ultra rich, although even that is still leaving out all the Zuckerbergs and the people that really have the big power. I've given you a lot to chew on there.
Well, I don't know where to begin. I never think about the 1%. I mean, like, it's so, like, after that number gets so large, it's like it's absolutely meaningless to me. It's like you make $6 million a year. I'm like, great, it could be $6 billion. I mean, I don't know. Like, it's so ridiculous. My first thought was like, well, you know, it said like on Obama's watch. I'm like, well, I guess the only good information is if it was on a Republican's watch, we'd be talking about the 0.001 making $12 million a year or something like that. You know, there's only so much you can do. But at the end of the day, everyone's got these sweet notions that like, oh, our country was founded on democracy. It's capitalism. I mean, capitalism trumps democracy. And you can't really blame people for going in, you know, into these money markets, into these hedge fund jobs. They want to make a lot of money. That's their thing. And they make a lot of money. And it's like, it's a really hard point. You just hope that they, at the end of the day, you hope that they give back, right? That you're making all this money, that maybe you can take, you know, your personal wealth and do good things with it. And if you don't, you just hope, you know, that they're miserable, you know, that they're horrible, miserable people.
But are they ever miserable? That's the question.
No,
they're never miserable, are they?
$6 million. First of all, no. Look, it's the things that I remember when Warren Buffett was saying at one point, I think when the economy was crashing, that based on the taxes he was paying, because a lot of his income was off of investments, he was paying like, I don't know, like 15%.
Right.
Whereas like normal people are paying like 30, 40%. Yeah. So he was making a point about that, first of all, about, you know, the thing of taxing the rich a little bit more and finding ways to get money from them. And then the other thing was, I just heard yesterday, it was saying some company, I forget what the company was, one of these big companies.
Caterpillar.
Was a Caterpillar, was underpaid like $2 billion in taxes or something because they found ways to do it.
They moved all their profits to a Swiss bank account, basically.
Yeah, so that's where you go, that's where you get upset. You go, oh dude, like I'm paying, every dollar I make, I'm paying 50 cents of that to the government, and there's these big companies that are finding loopholes. So that's where you go, come on man, you know, let's spread a little bit of that wealth.
I always thought that the Warren Buffett thing was kind of interesting because he would always say, well, my secretary is paying a higher tax than I am, which always made me think, well, why are you paying her so little? You know what I mean? Like, if you'd pay her more, then she'd be closer to your tax bracket. She'd be doing okay.
If you paid her with stocks, then she would pay, then she would not pay, then she'd pay less tax, but it's income.
Yeah.
So that's where you get screwed.
Yeah. So the part that you brought up is what this article that was analyzing this was also saying is that this gap between the ultra rich and the poor has gotten significantly bigger under Obama. And I think we all think somehow that it's the Republicans that are really bad about this, but this is one of these things where Obama has dropped the ball because the facts are the facts.
Well, I don't know if he's dropped the ball. I just don't know how much he can do, you know, in a way. It's like you talk about Wall Street reform. Well, Wall Street, that money fuels lobbyists and it fuels Congress. Like, there's only so much you're going to do to stop this money. You know what I mean? I just feel like it's, you know, it's like that thing when they were like, oh, Oprah, you should run for president. You know, you're like the most popular woman on the planet. And she's like, well, why would I give up all that power? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know if you can blame Obama constantly. I mean, on Obama's election night, all the bigwig Republicans like got in that room and they're like, we're going to do one thing, we're going to block everything that he intends to do, and they have, or they've been very successful at that. So I don't know if you can keep going back to
Obamacare.
I don't think they like black people.
Well, that's not true. No, it's naive to think that one person is going to make be able to run everything, and all you got to do is watch House of Cards, and you realize the vice president could be pulling the strings, you know, and there's a lot of things that are, backdoor deals being made, and it's a systemic thing, unfortunately, you know, and a lot of other countries do tax, you pay more taxes, but you don't have homeless people, for example. So it's the choice that we have to make. Do we want to pay less taxes and have homeless people, or pay more taxes and not have homeless people?
Was that House of Cards reference your way of telling us that you think Biden has killed someone?
I think Biden has definitely killed someone, and it's a great show.
Yeah, it is a pretty great show. Yeah. How should we generally feel about these super rich people? I'm not even talking about that 1%, then the 6 million people. You know, the people that are bringing in $6 million a year. I'm talking about the billionaire people. Should we be like this? George Soros this week just met with all the potential Republican 2016 guys, and it's like they have to go kiss the ring of just some rich guy.
Yeah,
and it's pretty sick, right?
Well, I mean, this morning it comes down to we have now less, restrictions on who can pay who to run for election. It's just,
thank you, Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you, Supreme Court. Way to reel it in, Supreme Court. So now I can give my, $10 to the Democrats. I don't know. It's so, it is when you really think about it, you feel powerless and it's really horribly discouraging. But then you're like, oh, there's a sale on wine. And that solves a lot of my problems when I think about the super rich.
Yeah. So how do you feel about
it? No, it's like, listen, man, if they made the money and they want to do what they want to do, they can do it. It's just the one thing that you do start worrying about is if the disparity continues, then you know, if you look at history, every revolution has, or many revolutions is based on economics.
Yeah.
So eventually there's going to be a breaking point. And so I think at some point the country does need to step back and go, okay, we can't have that many more people that are poor and this few that are rich, because eventually something will
Yeah,
give.
206 times the amount of the average income these people are making.
Seems like a bit much.
Yeah, and the loopholes, it's infuriating. And now, you know, it's unfortunate, but now everyone's armed. So, I mean, it could happen.
It could happen.